June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy trembled under the weight of history. But it was not merely the boots of Allied soldiers that terrified the Wehrmacht. From the landing craft and shoreline positions, a mechanical roar cut through the chaos of DAD. A sound that German soldiers had learned to dread across every theater of war. The distinctive thunderous bark of the Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun. Veterans of the Afrika Korps called it Der Knochensch, the bone saw. Eastern Front survivors whispered of it as America's Teufel, America's devil. To the German military, this weapon represented something far more horrifying than simple firepower. It embodied American industrial might made manifest in the most brutal terms possible. Obergefreiter Klaus Becker pressed his face into the cold Norman sand, his entire body trembling as another burst from an M2 shredded the concrete fortification 20 meters to his left. Chunks of reinforced German engineering concrete meant to withstand artillery exploded into deadly fragments. His squad leader, Feldwebel Ernst Hartmann, lay motionless beside him, his body torn nearly in half by a burst that had caught him attempting to reach the MG-42 nest. The 12.7mm rounds did not simply kill, they destroyed. They turned men into unrecognizable masses of torn flesh and shattered bone, rendered cover into Swiss cheese, and transformed the supposedly impregnable Atlantic Wall into a death trap for its defenders. The M2 had been born in 1933, the brainchild of legendary firearms designer John Moses Browning. Though he died before seeing his final masterpiece reach full production, what Browning created was nothing short of revolutionary. A belt-fed, or cold machine gun that fired thumb-sized cartridges at velocities approaching 3,000 feet per second. According to military archives maintained by the United States Army Center of Military History, each round carried kinetic energy equivalent to being struck by a small automobile traveling at highway speed. The weapon could fire at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards with devastating accuracy, and its cyclic rate of 450 to 600 rounds per minute meant it could blanket an entire battlefield sector with fire that penetrated virtually any protection available to infantry. German soldiers had faced machine guns before their own MG-34 and MG-42 were legendary for their rate of fire. But those weapons fired standard rifle cartridges, 7.92mm rounds, designed primarily for anti-personnel use. The American M2 fired something altogether different. Cartridge originally designed for anti-tank rifles in World War I, where German machine guns forced enemies to take cover. The M2 destroyed that cover entirely. Sandbags, logs, brick walls, light armor, plating, nothing that could be carried or quickly constructed offered protection against its fury. Becker watched in horror as another burst tore through the wooden beams supporting their trench network. Splinters the size of daggers exploded in every direction. The Americans had mounted these monsters on everything: tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, even aircraft. During the preceding months of aerial bombardment, Luftwaffe pilots had reported in increasingly desperate terms about American fighters equipped with multiple .50 caliber machine guns that could tear their aircraft apart at ranges where German rifle caliber weapons were useless. Now on the ground, the nightmare had arrived in force. November 8th, 1942 operation, Torch brought American forces crashing onto the beaches of North Africa. And with them came a weapon that would fundamentally alter German tactical doctrine. Lieutenant Hans Weber of the 21st Panzer Division had studied American equipment assessments with the casual dismissal typical of Wehrmacht officers who had conquered most of Europe. Americans were newcomers to modern warfare, he reasoned, their equipment surely inferior to German engineering. That assumption died screaming in the Tunisian desert, shredded by streams of tracer fire that seemed to reach across impossible distances. Weber's reconnaissance patrol had been probing American positions near Kasserine Pass when the world erupted in fire. An American half-track, seemingly alone and vulnerable, had opened fire at a range Weber's tactical training said was safely beyond effective machine gun distance. He watched in disbelief as his motorcycle combination simply disintegrated, the sidecar and its occupant vanishing in a spray of metal fragments and atomized flesh. His Kübelwagen, armored with steel plates that stopped rifle fire reliably, might as well have been constructed from paper. The .50 caliber rounds punched through the armor, through the driver, through the engine block, and out the other side, leaving perfectly round holes surrounded by petals of torn metal. The German military had developed extensive doctrine around the concept of fire and shade maneuver. using machine gun fire to suppress enemies while infantry advanced. But suppression required that the suppressed soldiers could survive by taking cover. Against the M2, there was no effective cover within 600 meters. German soldiers found themselves pinned down by fire that could reach them behind stone walls and ditches, inside buildings. Tank commanders discovered that their light panzers and armored cars, previously considered safe from machine gun fire, were vulnerable to this weapon at ranges where they could not effectively return fire. Hauptmann Dietrich Müller, a decorated veteran of the French and Polish campaigns, compiled a detailed report for Wehrmacht High Command, based on his battalion's encounters with American forces in Tunisia. Historical records preserved in the Bundesarchives document his increasingly alarmed assessments. The American .50 caliber machine gun, Müller wrote, represents a fundamental challenge to our tactical assumptions. Our soldiers cannot advance under its fire. Our light vehicles cannot approach positions it defends. Our fortifications cannot protect troops from its penetration. We are facing a weapon that bridges the gap between machine gun and light cannon, and we have no equivalent. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical destruction. German infantry had been trained to assault machine gun positions using suppressive fire and rapid movement. Squads would advance in bounds, using whatever cover the terrain offered, while their own machine guns forced defenders to keep their heads down. Against the M2, this doctrine failed catastrophically. The weapons range meant American gunners could engage German troops while they were still organizing their assault. Its penetration meant standard cover was useless. Its mounting on mobile platforms meant German forces could never predict where the devastating fire would come from next. Chefreiter Otto Schmidt survived 3 separate engagements against American M2 positions in North Africa. His written recollections, preserved in personal letters later archived by military historians, convey the terror these weapons inspired. We called artillery fire steel rain and respected it greatly, Schmidt wrote to his brother in April 1943. But artillery could be avoided with proper entrenchment and dispersion. The American Browning offers no such mercy. It finds you wherever you hide, tears through whatever you shelter behind, and does not cease until you are dead or it runs dry of ammunition. And the Americans never seem to run dry of ammunition. January 15th, 1943 Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann pushed his Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter into a climbing turn above Bizerte, pursuing what appeared to be a damaged American B-17 bomber straggling behind its formation. At 24, Hartmann was already an ace, with 12 confirmed kills, his Iron Cross earned through aggressive tactics and excellent marksmanship with his aircraft's 20mm cannons. He positioned himself carefully, preparing for the classic tail attack that had served him well against British bombers. What happened in the next 30 seconds would fundamentally change his understanding of aerial combatant, nearly cost him his life. The B-17, nicknamed Hell's Angels by its crew, was far from helpless. From its tail turret, waist positions, and dorsal turret, Browning M2 machine guns erupted in a coordinated defensive fire that seemed to fill the sky with tracers. Hartmann's fighter bucked violently as rounds tore through his starboard wing, H-impact transmitting through the airframe like hammer blows. His windscreen shattered, and something hot and sharp cut across his face. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his instrument panel as lines were severed. The FW-190, pride of the Luftwaffe's fighter squadrons, fell away trailing smoke and debris. Hartmann would survive barely, but 41 of his squadron mates would not live to see the war's end, many falling to the defensive .50 caliber fire of American bombers. The aerial dimension of the M2's dominance proved particularly devastating for the Luftwaffe. American fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt, P-51 Mustang, and P-38 Lightning bristled with these weapons. The P-47 carried 8.50 caliber machine guns, more firepower than entire German fighter squadrons could concentrate. Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned that engaging American fighters required extreme caution and preferably significant numerical superiority. Historical analysis from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey documents how this firepower advantage gradually shifted the balance of air superiority over Europe. Oberst Johann Steinhoff, a highly decorated Luftwaffe fighter ace who survived the war with 176 confirmed victories, later described the psychological burden of facing American fighters. It was not merely the number of guns, though that was intimidating enough. It was the devastating effect of hits. A burst from rifle-caliber weapons might damage an aircraft, perhaps kill the pilot if one was unlucky. But the American .50 caliber rounds tore apart everything they struck. Engine blocks cracked open, wings separated from fuselages, fuel tanks exploded. There was no such thing as minor damage from these weapons, only catastrophic destruction or miraculous escapes. German bomber crews faced even worse odds. The Luftwaffe's daylight strategic bombing capability effectively ended during the Battle of Britain, forced into night operations by unsustainable losses. Yet German bombers still occasionally attempted daylight raids against Allied targets, particularly during the early stages of the Italian campaign. These raids encountered American fighter escorts whose .50 caliber armament could destroy bombers at ranges where German defensive weapons were useless. The Heinkel He-111 and Junkers Ruhr 88 bombers, workhorses of the Luftwaffe, were particularly vulnerable. Their relatively light construction, adequate protection against rifle-caliber fire, offered no defense against the massive .50 caliber rounds that could sever control cables, ignite fuel systems, or kill crew members through the aircraft's skin. Major Wilhelm Herget, who commanded a bomber squadron operating from Italian bases, filed increasingly desperate requests for additional armor protection and heavier defensive armament. "Our gunners cannot effectively return fire against American fighters," he reported in May 1943. "They engage from beyond the effective range of our 13mm guns, and when they close to attack, their .50 caliber weapons tear through our aircraft as if the metal skin offers no more protection than fabric." August 23, 1944, the Soviet summer offensive had shattered German lines across hundreds of kilometers, and for the first time, Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front encountered a terrifying new element in Soviet attacks: American weapons supplied through the Lend-Lease program. Hauptmann Kurt Adler watched through binoculars as Soviet Guards infantry advanced behind a wall of heavy machine gun fire that seemed different from the usual Russian support weapons. The distinctive sound reached him seconds later, that heavy, measured bark that German veterans from other fronts recognized immediately with dread. Browning M2 machine guns, thousands of them supplied by the United States to the Red Army. The Soviets had received approximately 9,000 M2 machine guns through Lend-Lease by mid-1944, and they deployed them with devastating effectiveness. Soviet doctrine emphasized massed fire support, and the M2's range and penetration fit perfectly into their offensive tactics. German positions that might have held against standard Soviet machine guns found themselves under fire from ranges they considered safe. Bunkers constructed to resist rifle-caliber weapons were penetrated. Light vehicles were destroyed. Carefully prepared defensive positions that had allowed outnumbered German forces to resist Soviet attacks suddenly became death traps. Jeff Reiter, Karl Richter had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front. Weathering the brutality of Stalingrad's winter and the desperate defensive battles of 1943, he considered himself a veteran who had seen every horror modern warfare could produce. But the American weapons in Soviet hands introduced a new dimension of terror. The Russians were always brave, willing to attack again and again, despite casualties, Richter later recalled in interviews archived by military historians. But now they attacked with weapons that made our defensive positions useless. We could not stop them with rifle fire when their machine guns outranged ours. We could not hide in our bunkers when their .50 caliber guns tore through the logs and sandbags. We could only retreat or die. The Wehrmacht's defensive doctrine on the Eastern Front had evolved through brutal experience into a system of mutually supporting strongpoints, each capable of covering its neighbors with interlocking fire. German MG-42 machine guns, firing at rates exceeding 1,000 rounds per minute, could blanket approach routes with suppressive fire while supporting infantry-engaged attackers with rifles and Panzerfausts. This system worked remarkably well against standard Soviet infantry tactics until the M2 entered the equation. Soviet forces could now establish fire support positions beyond the effective range of German defensive weapons, systematically destroying strongpoints before infantry assaults even began. Oberst Heinrich Bauer commanded a regiment defending positions along the Vistula River in Poland during the summer of 1944. His after-action reports, preserved in military archives, document the tactical crisis the M2 created. "We face an impossible situation. Soviet infantry can now advance under covering fire from ranges where our weapons cannot effectively respond. Our machine gunners are killed by enemy fire before Soviet assault troops come within range. Our light bunkers are penetrated. Our vehicles are destroyed. Without heavy weapon support, and we receive fewer panzers and assault guns. Each month we cannot hold positions we would have defended successfully 1 year ago. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate tactical disadvantages. German soldiers had maintained morale on the Eastern Front, partly through the belief that their weapons and training were superior to Soviet equivalents. The appearance of American equipment undermined this assumption. If the Soviets now wielded weapons superior to German infantry arms, what did that say about the inevitable outcome of the war? Desertion rates, previously negligible in Eastern Front units despite horrific casualties, began climbing noticeably in late 1944 as soldiers faced the combined weight of Soviet numerical superiority and American industrial might. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Offensive. Hitler's desperate gamble to split Allied forces and recapture the strategic port of Antwerp began with German armored spearheads crashing through American lines in Belgium. For the first 72 hours, Wehrmacht and SS units made significant gains, overrunning surprised American positions and creating chaos in Allied rear areas. But as the initial shock wore off and American forces organized defensive lines, the German advance encountered an increasingly dense network of .50 caliber machine guns that would ultimately help doom the offensive to failure. Sturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Division Spearhead Battle Group, found his advance repeatedly stalled by small American units equipped with little more than Determination and Browning M2 machine guns. After-action reports, later examined during war crimes trials, documented growing frustration with American defensive firepower. A single M2 mounted on a half-track or in a hastily prepared position could hold up an entire column, forcing German armor to deploy and maneuver, consuming precious time and fuel. When German infantry attempted to assault these positions, they were cut down by fire that penetrated their cover and tore through multiple soldiers with single bursts. Oberscharfer Otto Skorzeny, the famous SS commando leader who participated in the Ardennes offensive, commanding a unit of English-speaking Germans in American uniforms, later wrote extensively about American firepower advantages, according to his post-war memoirs, archived in various military history collections. The American .50 caliber machine gun represented a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Our soldiers had learned to fear its distinctive sound, its incredible range, its devastating impact. Even when we achieved local superiority, even when we captured American positions, we found ourselves inheriting defensive positions dominated by American weapons we had inadequate ammunition to employ effectively. The Americans seemed to have infinite supplies of ammunition for their heavy machine guns. We captured positions with thousands upon thousands of expended .50 caliber casings surrounding each gun position. The battle for Bastogne exemplified the M2's defensive capabilities. American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and outnumbered, established a defensive perimeter bristled with .50 caliber machine guns, salvaged from destroyed vehicles and captured from German supply columns. These weapons, mounted on improvised ground mounts or remaining functional on damaged vehicles, created interlocking fields of fire that made German assaults suicidally expensive. Grenadier Regiment 947 lost over 60% of its strength attempting to penetrate American positions on the northern perimeter, with survivors reporting that the defensive fire was unlike anything they had experienced in previous battles. Lieutenant Hans Klieg led his platoon in 3 separate assault attempts against American positions defending a crucial crossroads near Bastogne. Each attack was torn apart by .50 caliber fire before his soldiers could close to grenade-throwing range. We could not approach, Koenig testified during post-war interviews. The American machine guns reached far beyond the range where our assault rifles and machine guns could suppress them. We advanced across open ground under fire that killed men 2 and 3 at a time when bullets passed through multiple bodies. Our platoon sergeant was torn nearly in half. Our machine gun team was wiped out when a burst struck their MG-42's ammunition belt, and the tracers ignited our own ammunition.
Ow.
We retreated after losing 32 men without inflicting a single casualty on the Americans. The Ardennes offensive ultimately failed for many reasons: insufficient fuel, clearing weather that allowed Allied aircraft to attack German columns, overextended supply lines, and stubborn American resistance. But tactical reports from German commanders consistently cited American firepower, particularly .50 caliber machine guns, as a critical factor limiting their advance. Every hour German forces spent deploying to assault M2 positions was an hour American reinforcements could arrive. Every casualty inflicted by these weapons was an irreplaceable loss for divisions already under strength. By the time the offensive collapsed in January 1945, Wehrmacht combat strength had been bled white partly through encountering defensive firepower they could not overcome. February 11th, 1945, American forces crossed the Roe River and began their final drive toward the Rhine, encountering the Siegfried Line's extensive fortifications. The West Wall, as Germans called it, consisted of thousands of bunkers, pillboxes, and dragon's teeth tank obstacles stretching hundreds of kilometers along Germany's western border. These fortifications had been constructed in the 1930s to withstand attacks by weapons of that era: conventional artillery, rifle-caliber machine guns, and light anti-tank weapons. They were not designed to resist the Browning M250 caliber machine gun. Feldwebel Anton Weber commanded a bunker complex near Aachen, positioned to cover a vital road junction with interlocking fire from 3 reinforced concrete positions. His bunker featured walls 60 centimeters thick, with firing ports designed to minimize exposure while allowing his MG-42 to sweep approach routes. Wehrmacht engineers had assured him the position could withstand direct hits from medium artillery. They had not considered that American doctrine emphasized the use of .50 caliber machine guns in what infantry manuals described as bunker suppression roles. Weber learned this oversight's fatal implications when an American half-track moved into position 600 meters from his bunker and began systematic fire. The first burst struck the concrete surrounding his firing port, and Weber instinctively ducked back as dust and fragments exploded inward. He had experienced artillery strikes before the bunker shook, but held firm. But this was different. The firing continued, burst after methodical burst, and he realized with growing horror that the Americans were not trying to destroy the bunker. They were widening the firing port. The massive .50 caliber rounds chipped away at the concrete, with each impact gradually enlarging the opening. After perhaps 100 rounds, bullets began penetrating into the bunker interior, ricocheting off the walls and floor in deadly unpredictability. After 200 rounds, the opening was large enough that burst after burst poured directly inside, making the bunker itself a killing box rather than a defensive position. Weber's 3-man crew evacuated through the rear exit after his loader was killed by a ricochet that struck him in the spine. They retreated to the secondary position, only to watch American infantry methodically work their way forward under continuous .50 caliber, covering fire that kept every German position suppressed. When defenders attempted to return fire, the M2 bursts torn through firing ports, destroyed periscopes, and eventually penetrated the bunkers themselves. American after-action reports from operations along the Siegfried Line, archived in the National Archives and Records Administration, document how infantry units used .50 caliber machine guns as bunker busters by concentrating fire on firing ports and vision slits until the positions became untenable. Hauptmann Friedrich Lang, responsible for a 5-kilometer section of the West Wall defenses, filed increasingly desperate reports as American forces systematically reduced his positions. The enemy employs their heavy machine guns with devastating effectiveness against our fortifications, he reported on February 21, 1945. They establish fire support positions beyond our effective range and conduct sustained fire against individual bunkers until the positions must be abandoned. Our casualties mount continuously from fire that penetrates our fortifications or ricochets within them. Morale is deteriorating rapidly as soldiers recognize that our strongest defensive positions offer no protection against American weapons. The tactical revolution this represented cannot be overstated. For centuries, fortifications had provided defending forces with enormous advantages, allowing small numbers of soldiers to resist much larger attacking forces. Machine guns had further strengthened defensive positions by multiplying the firepower available to defenders. But the M2's combination of range, penetration, and sustained fire capability fundamentally altered this calculus. American forces could suppress German bunkers from standoff ranges, systematically destroy fighting positions, and advance under covering fire that made counterattacks suicidal. The Siegfried Line, which German propaganda had declared impregnable, fell in weeks rather than the months German commanders had expected it would delay Allied advances. March 28, 1945, Wilhelm Hoffmann sat in what remained of his regimental command post, a basement in the ruins of a town whose name he could no longer remember. At 46 years old, he had served in the German army since 1917, survived World War I's trenches, and commanded troops across every major front of this war. Now, as American forces closed on what remained of his defensive sector, he contemplated the evolution of warfare through the lens of a single weapon that had become synonymous with American military might: the Browning .50 caliber machine gun. Hoffmann had studied weapons development throughout his career. He understood that the M2 represented more than merely superior engineering. It embodied fundamental philosophical differences between American and German approaches to warfare. German doctrine emphasized precision, training, and tactical excellence. The Wehrmacht's weapons reflected this philosophy: accurate, efficient, designed for skilled soldiers to achieve maximum effect with minimum expenditure. The MG42 machine gun exemplified this approach: a ganably high rate of fire, excellent accuracy, but chambered for a standard rifle cartridge to simplify logistics and allow infantry to share ammunition. The American M2 represented a different philosophy entirely: overwhelming firepower as a substitute for tactical finesse, massive ammunition expenditure to guarantee effect, an acceptance of logistical complexity in exchange for battlefield dominance. Where German weapons asked skilled soldiers to do more with less, American weapons allowed average soldiers to project devastating firepower with minimal training. Hoffmann recognized, with the clarity of impending defeat, that the American approach had proven superior under the conditions of industrial warfare. Skill and training could not compensate for being outranged, outgunned, and unable to take cover. His soldiers, those who remained, now viewed the M2 with something approaching supernatural dread. They had developed an entire folklore around the weapon: stories of bunkers torn apart, tanks destroyed, soldiers killed 3 and 4 at a time by bullets that passed through bodies without slowing. Hoffmann knew these stories were exaggerated, but only slightly. He had seen the effects himself too many times. The round's massive size, over 12 centimeters in length, weighing over 100 grams, carried kinetic energy sufficient to cause catastrophic damage to anything it struck. Unlike rifle bullets that made neat holes and caused localized trauma, .50 caliber rounds created massive temporary wound cavities that destroyed everything within inches of the bullet's path through the body. Medical reports from field hospitals painted a grim picture. Soldiers wounded by .50 caliber fire rarely survived if struck in the torso. The massive tissue destruction caused by the round's passage through the body cavity led to rapid exsanguination before medical treatment could be provided. Limb wounds that would have been survivable from rifle fire resulted in amputations, as the hydrostatic shock destroyed muscle, bone, and blood vessels far from the bullet's actual path. Field surgeons reported that .50 caliber wounds looked more like artillery fragment injuries than gunshot wounds, with massive tissue loss and contamination. Hoffmann considered the broader strategic implications as artillery rumbled in the distant American guns. Of course, their shells as abundant as their machine gun ammunition. Germany had lost this war not on any particular battlefield, but in American factories that produced weapons and ammunition in quantities German industry could never match. The M2 symbolized this disparity perfectly. Each gun required extensive machining, skilled assembly, and significant material resources to produce. Germany could have manufactured similar weapons. Their engineers certainly possessed the technical knowledge, but they lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful numbers, while simultaneously building tanks, aircraft, and artillery in quantities sufficient to compete with Allied production. The Americans, blessed with vast resources and secure production facilities beyond German bombing range, had manufactured over 2 million .50 caliber machine guns during the war years. They had mounted them on virtually every vehicle, aircraft, and defensive position their forces employed. German soldiers faced these weapons in every theater, from every direction, in quantities that made avoidance impossible. Hoffmann realized with bitter clarity that Germany's fate had been sealed not by tactical failures or strategic miscalculations, but by the simple mathematics of industrial production. It's the nation that could equip every squad, every vehicle, Every position with weapons like the M2 could not be defeated by even the most skilled and determined opponents. Armed with lesser firepower? April 30th, 1945's, the war in Europe effectively ended with Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker. Fighting would continue for several more days until the official surrender on May 8th. Throughout Germany, in ruins and refugee columns and hastily constructed prisoner of war camps, Wehrmacht veterans carried memories of the weapon that had become synonymous with American military power and their own defeat. The psychological impact of the M2.50 caliber machine gun would outlast the war itself, shaping military doctrine and weapons development for decades. In the immediate post-war period, captured German officers and soldiers underwent extensive debriefing by Allied intelligence services. These interrogations, documented in thousands of pages of archived reports, reveal the profound impression the M2 made on German military thinking. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer-Lehr Division through campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and France, provided particularly detailed assessments. The American .50 caliber machine gun represented a categorical advantage we could never overcome, he testified. Tacified in defensive positions, it outranged our weapons and penetrated our fortifications. On vehicles, it allowed American forces to engage our troops from beyond effective rifle range. On aircraft, it gave American fighters and bombers firepower our interceptors could not match. We had no equivalent weapon, and by the time we fully appreciated its impact on tactical operations, we lacked the industrial capacity to develop and produce alternatives in sufficient quantity. The weapon's psychological impact extended beyond its actual tactical effects. German soldiers had developed what military psychologists would later term learned helplessness in response to the M2's omnipresence and apparent invincibility. When the distinctive sound of .50 caliber fire echoed across a battlefield, German infantry instinctively sought cover and, when the fire was directed elsewhere, even when their tactical situation required aggressive action. This reflexive fear burned into soldiers through repeated traumatic encounters, reduced unit cohesion and combat effectiveness in measurable ways. Oberst Hans von Luck, decorated panzer commander who survived the war and later wrote extensively about his experiences, reflected on how the M2 embodied everything that had gone wrong with Germany's war effort. We believed in the superiority of German engineering, German training, German tactical doctrine, and in many ways our beliefs were justified. Our tanks were often better designed, our soldiers often better trained, our tactics often more sophisticated than our opponents. But the Americans demonstrated that adequacy produced in overwhelming quantity defeats excellence produced in limited numbers. Their .50 caliber machine gun was not particularly sophisticated. The basic design dated to the 1920s, but they manufactured it by the millions, supplied ammunition by the billions of rounds, and employed it everywhere. How does one defeat an enemy who can afford to equip every squad with a weapon that outranges your machine guns, every vehicle with firepower that threatens your armor, every position with a gun that penetrates your fortifications? The post-war German military, reconstituted as the Bundeswehr in 1955, explicitly incorporated lessons learned from facing the M2 into its doctrine and equipment programs. German military planners emphasized the need for infantry weapons with greater effective range, vehicle-mounted weapon systems capable of providing heavy fire support, and fortifications designed to resist weapons more powerful than rifle-caliber machine guns. The trauma of encountering overwhelming firepower they could not match shaped an entire generation of military thinking. Ironically, the Bundeswehr ultimately adopted the Browning M2 as its standard heavy machine gun, equipping its vehicles and defensive positions with the same weapon that had terrorized Wehrmacht soldiers a decade earlier. When questioned about this decision, Bundeswehr planners were pragmatic. No better alternative existed, and membership in NATO provided access to American manufacturing capacity that ensured adequate supply. German veterans, now wearing different uniforms and serving a different government, trained on weapons they had once faced from the other side of no man's land. The M2's legacy extended far beyond Germany's experience. The weapon remains in active service with American forces 80 years after its introduction. Having served in every conflict from World War II through the present day, modern versions feature improved manufacturing techniques and minor modifications, but the basic design Browning perfected in the 1930s remains fundamentally unchanged. This longevity testifies to the design's effectiveness and to the accuracy of German assessments regarding its battlefield dominance. For the German soldiers who faced it, the M2 represented something more profound than simply another weapon. It embodied the industrial and material disparity that ultimately determined the war's outcome, regardless of tactical skill or strategic planning. In memoirs, interviews, and military analyses produced by Wehrmacht veterans, the .50 caliber machine gun appears again and again as a symbol of American power and German defeat, a weapon so effective, so ubiquitous, and so devastating that it changed the nature of infantry combat itself. That it inspired such dread among soldiers who had faced the horrors of mechanized warfare on multiple continents speaks to both its technical excellence and its psychological impact. The hate German soldiers felt toward the M2 was the hate of soldiers who found themselves outmatched by a weapon they could neither counter nor escape, whose presence on the battlefield made their training and courage insufficient for survival. It was the hate born of watching comrades torn apart by fire they could not return effectively, of seeing fortifications penetrated and vehicles destroyed by a machine gun when machine guns were supposed to threaten only infantry. It was, ultimately, the hate of recognizing that industrial might had proven more decisive than martial valor, that the side with superior factories had triumphed over the side with superior soldiers. That lesson, burned into German military consciousness through encounters with the Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun, would shape military doctrine and strategic thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond.